Dr. Amanosowate is a security academic. He will speak to us on how he sees the situation. Doc, thanks for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to you, Bernard. Good morning to your listeners. Thanks for having me.
When I heard that there was a coup attempt in Benin, I was a bit shocked because my little knowledge of Benin was that it was one of the most stable West African countries and that their democracy seemed to be working pretty well, and also that the new government seemed to be doing quite well. People talk about the infrastructure, the order in the town. So it's a bit surprising to hear that some people are trying to launch a coup. But my colleague is telling me that maybe the concern in Benin was the security. You're looking at the insurgency in parts of the Western African area, which may have been the basis for the coup. What are your thoughts on what could possibly embolden a few soldiers to try and topple a government that most people seem to think is doing well?
So a number of things, I think. The first one is that I'm very careful when I'm talking about causal relationships, because causal relationship and those influences are very complicated subjects, but you can talk about association instead of causal relationship. The second thing is that stability is not vouchsafed. Stability is as a product of so many variables: economic well-being, cost of livelihood, security sector governance and reform, the orientation of the security, and things like that, the role of the media and things like that. They all have a role to play. And I believe that when some of these variables, and these variables can be graded, right? Some are more primary than others. When some of these variables begin to be altered as a product of internal and external factors, then stability might start wobbling. The degree of which it will wobble will be contingent of so many other factors. So it might wobble in certain countries and then stand like a tsunami of an earthquake, depending on the design of the building. It might sway, you see it visibly swaying, but it comes back to its normal position. So from where I sit, I think that there are many factors. I think for us as a country, one of it is that we shouldn't take our security and safety for granted. I'm sure you come to that question. But I wasn't too surprised because I know that these coups are possible in most West African countries. I wasn't very surprised. If there are elements of surprise for me, it's on the issue of scale. So, for example, if it happens in Benin, I'll be very surprised than if it happens in other countries. But there are also surprises too, generally.
I see. So
this is a medium-range answer. Yeah.
Wonderful. Now, the information we are getting suggests that the coup attempt failed and that there was external support for the Beninois government. Indeed, we are told that the president of Benin sent a note verbal, or his foreign minister sent a note verbal to his colleagues in Nigeria, and the president of Nigeria sent some Air Force troops to help quell the coup. Will this be unprecedented for a West African neighbor to help foil a coup in another country? I'm trying to rack my brain to see if this has happened in the past, and I'm not sure I can tell of any instance like that.
Okay, I don't readily, I'm very careful when it comes to historical accounts, because my first degree is history. Sometimes there are things that might not be oblivious to you, but if you go and dig, you see that there's a precedent. But as I said here, I don't remember. You see, in 1979, I was young. I was just about 9 or 10 years. But I remember that between 79 and 80 and thereabouts, I remember that sometimes we hear that Russia has sent its troops to Ghana, Tema, to come and prevent, a possibly CIA orchestrated coup. We're caught in between the Cold War and politics and things like that, or real politics, so to speak. So we heard those rumors when we were much younger. But like Mozambique, I think it's Mozambique, where I think Castro has some troops. I don't think, in Angola in particular, I don't think that I can recall in West Africa. But then there's a footnote to this response. If you look at ECOWAS intervention and you look at the intervention as a function of dealing with insecurity or potential insecurity, then we have precedent. So I'm saying that depending on the team that you are dealing with, you might say that, okay, ECOWAS dealt with some form of instability, some form of problem. And so if you are looking at Benin as a form of security problem that has the potential to cascade, then maybe from that perspective, from that very narrow perspective, one can say that, yes, there is a precedent. But in terms of specific country calling for military support within a short time of coup attempt, I don't readily recall anything like that. But I stand corrected. I always want to leave an avenue to escape, so to speak. Yeah.
But now that it's happened, what type of precedent does it set? Because the Nigerian government sent out a statement explaining its role and essentially commending their armed forces for the work they did. Of course, the Benin government's announcement didn't make direct reference to the Nigerians, but we know that whatever the Nigerians did was under the command of the Benin forces. But my question is twofold. What kind of precedent does it set for a country in the sub-region to send troops or accoutrement to support a sitting government against a coup attempt? That's number one. And number two, ECOWAS itself is sending a standby force to Benin comprising of soldiers from 4 countries, Ghana being one of them. That they seem to mean this time as against what they did with Niger. What are your thoughts?
Okay, thank you so much. Now, a number of things here, I think. Now, you use the word accoutrement, and I don't think you fettered that word. So if you leave that word unfettered, it gives me a room to navigate my response. Now, I know that in the past, some countries in West Africa had not sent boots on the ground, but had created sanctuaries for people who wanted to destabilize maybe other countries, or had played a role in preventing people from destabilizing other countries. In other words, if you see intelligence as a critical part of any security challenge or any security stability, then you might say that you don't necessarily need troops or boots on the ground to say you are supporting and or you are undermining a particular regime. Okay, so from that perspective, there are precedents where people supported different countries through intelligence, through providing sanctuary for those who are against them and things like that. So that is one way, because those factors are very, very important in having a successful coup or not having a successful coup and things like that. That's one part, not boots on the ground, but intelligence. Now, the other thing about precedent, you see, a lot of countries would invest blood and treasure, blood and money, based on their national security interests. Almost every country does that from history. Blood and money, blood and money. But before they invest blood and money, and your question is about blood and money, why did Nigeria send troops? So it is blood and it is money. Okay, at the minimum. Why do they send troops? Usually they send troops depending on the context, based on so many factors. One of it is the national security interest of a country. Now, when I say national security interest, I leave unanswered what national security means. Because sometimes, almost invariably, depending on the context, national security is seen to be coterminous with regime security. In other words, some of the things that the regime would do would be antithetical to national development and national security stability. Why? Because it is very exclusive. It is very geared towards a particular regime, even if that regime's actions and inactions undermine broader national cohesion, broader national stability. And so when you are talking about the blood and money, and you are talking about countries investing blood and money, you want to understand what the decision-making process, who were those involved, how were the decisions taken. It presupposes that those who take those decisions put the state ahead of their partisan interests. And I think that that perspective is very important. And that brings me to something, if you permit me, to quote something from Nana Konnedu's book. I think this particular statement, I've quoted it verbatim about 3 or 4 times in different media outlets. And I think it's very relevant. I'm talking about her book, It Takes a Woman, A Life Shaped by Heritage, Leadership, and the Woman Who Defined It. I think that she should have had love or romance in the title, but anyway, that's for another day. Now, in this book, Nana Konnedu says something very, very important. And this is Konnedu, who had straddled the positionality as an insider to an outsider. What I mean by that is that this was somebody in 79. She wasn't an insider at the tactical and operational level, but she was exposed to that. And then she became the first lady for a long time. And then after that, she went out of NDC. And this is somebody who has this breadth of experience. And listen to what she said, specifically on page 205. It is, quote, "It is refreshingly amazing to uncover how when a person opens his mind to non-partisan thinking and is focused solely on what is best for Ghana, he she said he, but you cannot see. He or she cannot help but see the wisdom in the places and moments where he had not seen it before. Let me take that again. It is refreshingly amazing to uncover how when a person opens his mind to non-partisan thinking and is focused solely on what is best for Ghana, he cannot but see the wisdom in places and moments where he did not see it before. Unquote. Why is this important? Now, once I'm talking about blood and treasure, I also talked about national security interest. Now, that national security interest should come from the perspective of what Nana Konidi just said, that there are certain decisions when you take from the standpoint of active partisan politics, what you do might be antithetical to the development of the national security, these are now my words, right? To the national security of every country. In other words, or put another way, I think that one way of investing treasure and blood is to see the extent to which your investment will impact short, medium, long-term or national security. But that decision should be inclusive, and that decision should be in the interest of not any particular regime, but for the country. And I think that then opens us to a whole debate. Would other countries also send troops when they are attempted coups? Would every country be on the same pedestal? In other words, would Nigeria send troops to Senegal? Would Nigeria send troops to Ghana? Would Nigeria send troops to Mali? Because then it opens up a precedent. I think that we are not going to see like a carte blanche type of state intervening. Although, of course, ECOWAS conflict prevention protocols give the ECOWAS body that mandate, so to speak. But I think that it's going to be more nuanced. Hopefully, Parliament, civil society, and the media will have a critical role to play in the trajectory that we take in this direction.
Thank you. One of my listeners has informed me that there was a time where President Abacha sent troops to reinstate Ahmed Tijan Kaba also, if I am not...
Oh, yes, I know that story.
Yes.
But, okay.
So let me say, in 1998, the Abacha government sent troops to restore the democratic government of Ahmed Tijan Kaba of Sierra Leone. But I'm not sure it was a direct... Yeah. So,
yes, but you see, Abacha was a military regime. You see, when it comes to ECOMOG, the amount of blood and money Nigeria spent on ECOMOG, I'm not too sure whether Nigeria would have done that under democratic dispensation. In other words, the processes and the ability of countries under military regime to do certain things are not the same like when it comes to democratic regime. So I was thinking more of democratic regime, although this reminder is very important. But I think that then you fit in what the person has said within the context of what I said about national security and what it means, and whether regime security is coterminous with national security, and the extent to which in the past a lot of national security was almost invariably regime security and non-nation, because opposition had no role to play. You couldn't have free media, you couldn't criticize and things like that. So that was more of a regime thing. So the person is right. I remember that Tijan Kaba thing, before the war still went back at a point. I think that generally, please correct me, we are talking about democratic regimes, but it is true that precedents can be broadened out to include military and democratic regimes.
Finally, what do you suppose this means for the whole sub-region? Because it's like almost every 6 months we hear of a coup. As I sit here, apart from Madagascar, which is not really close, a lot of the coups have happened either in the Sahel or the West African sub-region. You know, I'm not sure what Ghana should be thinking at this point, you know. I mean, and to make it worse, Cote d'Ivoire has had an election which many people feel was not fair, because the two leading contenders who could oppose the president were not allowed to stand, and the president himself sort of fiddled with the constitution to allow himself to go for another term. Togo's president has some interesting new rules around his tenure, which could extend his reign for a long time. You get it? So then there's Burkina Faso, which is being run by a military leader. Then there's Mali, there's Niger. I mean, there's Guinea-Bissau last 2 weeks. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure what's going on and how worried should Ghana be.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this question. As usual, brilliant question. Okay, so a number of things. Now, there are different schools of thought regarding what coup mean? Coup, what does it mean? Does it mean the use of firearms, or it can be unconstitutional? Now, you can look at this particular issue. You could use just critical feminist lens. Critical feminist lens basically talks about looking at things that have been taken for granted for a long time because people have not challenged it. So, for example, you might have norms, and you can have gender socialization that would steer a particular gender into positions of power and influence, and other genders to a position of subjugation and inferior status. That might not be expressly written, but it is implied from the standpoint of socialization. In other words, when you want to just look at the outward appearance, you might make a mistake, and that is where the issue that you raise is very important. What do we mean by coups? Are coups only characterized by the use of firearms, or people can manipulate the constitution? And that constitutional manipulation, if it subverts what people expect from democratic governance, that's the coup d'etat. And that brings us then to the issue of ECOWAS. When people are not using guns, but they are using other means to outwit or outmaneuver or to circumvent strictures that have been agreed on and laid out for people to ascend the reins of power and get out of reins of power. When those strictures are being outmaneuvered and outflanked by particularly those in power, what does ECOWAS do? Or that is not a coup d'etat? Because you see, when people, let me go back to the camp proverb. There's a kind of proverb that says that begin camp papa in credit. In other words, you always want to look at you understand? You always have to check why certain things occur. In West Africa, I think that the factors are, multi-dimensional in terms of leading to these coups. But I'm very careful about talking about causal relationships. I can talk more associations. Now, if ECOWAS sits down for others to outmaneuver the constitution, and they don't see that as a coup, it affects their own credibility to some extent. The other thing that I think is important is what Ghana can learn. I'm being selfish here, and I understand perfectly that there's a strong symbiosis between Ghana's security and that of our contiguous and distant neighbors. I'm very much aware of that. That no country, including America and China, can live in an island. I appreciate that. But for Ghana, I think that one of the things that we can do is that people say that when your neighbor's beard is on fire, you fetch water by yours. I think that, yes, that is one place, one perspective. But another thing is to dip your beard in water or to remove the beard totally. Now, what does that got to do with your question for Ghana? I think President Mahama a few months ago was addressing some political leaders, I think so, some leaders of some sort. And he said that the coups happening in West Africa should be lessons for politicians. Now, these are now my words. I'm paraphrasing what I understood him to have said. And he said that he's not going to use anybody. But during his own inauguration, when Ibrahim Traoré was introduced, the way the crowd received him, the applause, the jubilations around him, told him something, because there were other people who had been elected. But this guy had come through a coup d'etat. And I think that there's no other lesson Ghana can learn from that topmost part of the country. No, it's not the topmost part. From the executive than what President Mahama has said. In other words, he has seen it himself, he has said it himself, and I think he's very much aware. That brings me to what I think we can do as a country. The first thing I think that the elite, it doesn't matter whether NPP or NDC, the political elite should understand that their security and safety is very much tied to the ordinary person. If there's one thing saying it with your lips and another thing believing it in your heart, you can say it like hocus pocus. You say one thing, you do something else. Why is that important? You see, I'm one person who stood against giving members of parliament and certain people police protection. And there was a reason for that. You see, you always have to, at some minimum level of extent, feel and appreciate what the people are going through. When you are disconnected, it brings a problem. Now, in the past few weeks, the president of Nigeria, GCFR, has said that they are withdrawing all police protection for individuals, I'm sure they include politicians of particular kind, to go and fight Boko Haram. Why is that important to the discussion? I think that when the political elect think that they can have certain resources to protect them, state resources, not private state, to protect them, and that cocoons them from the feeling of the ordinary people, you begin to, there's something called relative deprivation theory. You see, you begin to create some level of bitterness. And one way of demonstrating that bitterness, of seeing that bitterness being demonstrated, is through the ballot box. And the ballot box will give you an early warning to say that, why is it that a lot of people voted along this line? What does it mean? Because the challenge is that, Able, let me try and end on this note. You know that most of the issues about corruption, it is not through investigative journalists. No, it's the politicians themselves. When NDC comes to power, in the first few months, they will show us the amount of money that MPP has misappropriated, they themselves. And then when there is a change, MPP will come and tell us the amount of money that NDC has misappropriated. And the two of them are politicians. So the issue is that it is not the ordinary person who is investigating, it's the same politician. Somebody might say NDC is different from MPP, but that is one perspective. Another perspective is that they are politicians. And it's the politicians who are telling us that their own kind are taking a lot of national resources. Is it fair to homogenize? I understand perfectly the dangers of overgeneralization and homogenizing groups that are very heterogeneous because they have different ethical values, different standards. But you see, when it gets to certain security threats and challenges, like 79, when I was young, but I saw it, people are placed in the basket. But they're politicians who are honest. They're politicians who use a lot of their money to serve their constituents. But when there's a problem, they'll all be put together. And if a coup happens in Ghana, and I say if, I don't want it to happen. If it happens in Ghana, it doesn't matter the party you belong to. The politicians will suffer. Ordinary people of a particular standing in society will suffer. For example, it can be anybody with 4x4. But there are people with 4x4 who have worked well. And that brings me back to my point, that the elite, I think, should always sit down and understand that their security is tied to the ordinary people. Able, see, when the politicians come to power and they are building houses, they are not masons, they are not plumbers, they are not electricians, they don't mow the block. There are people who are ordinary people who know that this politician built these houses because we build it for him here, we build the other one for him here. The plumbers, they know, the ordinary people. They go to market and they suffer. Bank accounts, the bank accounts are not operated, even if it's AI, to understand human beings. Those human beings know the accounts of politicians before they come to power. And how the account looks like, sometimes within a short time, they know, they see. And so the lesson for Ghana is that starting from the political elite, the ruling elite, it's not only politicians who, when you go to military, the top guys in the military, some of the properties they have, it is in our interest. And I'm one of them who, I don't remove myself. I know when there's a coup, I'll be potential challenge because of my status. I have a 4x4, I was using a Mercedes, I have a Honda, I have plans. You understand? But then people will not know that I was working in an international organization and brought my money here. No, everybody is first of all a legitimate target. And so what Ghana can do and Ghana should do is that I think the best way of avoiding coup is understanding that I'm repeating myself more than 10 times in a minute, that the interest of the ordinary person, the well-being, the security, the life and livelihood, Africa has the most useful population. That is our strength. I think that is the way, at that basic level, at that granular level of preventing. I can do a more granular analysis of other aspects like the military welfare, the resources they have, how the military is oriented towards dealing with such issues, the intelligence community. We can go on and on. But let me end on this note. I still believe that Ghana has the ability and we will continue to be stable in a sub-breeding characterized by these, because I believe we can do that. Why do I believe that? Apart from my faith, it is very strong. I also believe that at least we have a strong media that is not being gaggled to air grievances, and those are avenues for early warning.
Dr. Emmanuel Sobate, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your insights. He's a security analyst